Thank you for coming. I'm John Shull. I am founder from e-NABLE, but today I'm going to talk about e-NABLE and things that e-NABLE may be able to help us think about as we try to deal with our current array of disasters. We have a climate crisis. The cradle of civilization is on fire. We have a COVID crisis. We have mass extinctions and loss of biodiversity. And we love tinkering with technology. Are we tinkering while Rome burns? That's my question. Planet A is failing. Plan A, therefore, the way we do things traditionally has failed. There is no planet B. So clearly, we need either a plan B or a network of plans B and a system for scaling up plans B that work and don't fall into the traps that apparently plan A doesn't know how to get us out of. And by the way, I can see your faces, and if you're free to raise your hand. I pretend to know something about some of these topics because I started a global volunteer assistive technology built on an infrastructure of electronic communications and 3D printing, but not just, and goodwill and caring. That's the e-NABLE network. I started it, frankly, by a gesture, which was a complete lie. I put up this slide as in a comment on a YouTube video, which was about an early effort to make 3D printed prosthetics. And the video went viral, and this claim, which was totally aspirational, went viral with it. And over the course of 7 years, e-NABLE has become a global network of volunteers. And our history is, I think, instructive. We started as a small group, and we had the motto, changing the world one hand at a time. But this whole thing went viral, and we created a Google Plus community, which in the course of 2 years went from 0 to 10,000 people, and there was a lot of activity. And it became a global movement. And it ran into some instructive problems. First of all, the Google Plus community was filled with interesting and provocative people. We had a code of conduct, which was based on respect and on sharing and goodwill and good nature. And I still endorse this code of conduct. I think it's really very valuable. However, as we grew, first, we found that the code of conduct was hard to maintain. It took me a long while to catch on to the notion that as moderator of this environment, I really needed to kick a few people out if they were acting as trolls. But it took a while. And so after about 5 or 6 years, we were a large organization. No, we in fact had become a large organization. We had 10,000 people, and we sort of turned on each other. These are the nicest people on the planet doing 3D prosthetic for nice people, and yet it all fell apart. Now, I've thought a lot since then. By the way, we're doing quite well. We have recovered. We're in recovery, and I think we have some new patterns which are very helpful for the present lesson, which is why I'm dragging you through this unpleasant history. What went wrong? First of all, a few of us got ahead of general consensus and culture. We did the obvious thing. And we did it with the help of the Fab Foundation. We created a not-for-profit foundation called the e-NABLE Community Foundation, in order to build up what seemed like the obvious thing, a centrally organized nonprofit that could work on a global scale. And we hired professional management, and money and professional management, in our case, undermined our self-organized and productively disorganized voluntary community of amateurs. Like many Fab Labs, which need business models, we didn't have a business model. And it turns out that a truly volunteer network can go a long, long way without a business model. And it can do things that conventional organizations can't do. And that's what we eventually came to realize. Part of the problem I'm talking about, and it's a problem that hits every online community, is that when you get enough people in an online community, the complexity of communication, the number of interactions, and the potential for trolls to entertain themselves by being disruptive inevitably fails. I say inevitably because, as has been written in articles for 30 years, every single online community that grows exponentially eventually hits a point where it turns on itself. And we saw it in American democracy just 4 years ago when Facebook and the online networks got too big to handle some of our worst tendencies. And so I think this is a built-in vulnerability of the online networks, which are an increasingly important part of our world. e-NABLE now describes itself as a movement. It's not an organization. And I think there are some important differences between movements and organizations. And I've tried to capture some of them here. In the case of e-NABLE, a caring network of volunteers who see their mission as to help underserved populations, the ones who are missed by conventional organizations, works very differently from a conventional organization. e-NABLE now is very much a network non-starfish-like organization, which is comprised of, at this point, about 200 chapters around the world, in about 60 countries, as well as individuals in a total of 90 countries. And it's a going concern that continues to grow incrementally, even though, if you look at this diagram of our actual ecology, there's really very little central organization. And, all of these individual chapters and individuals do their thing, united by shared values, shared open source ideas, and a shared commitment to serving people who have been missed by conventional organizations. Our methods are really very much the methods of the open source community and of Fab Labs. And like the Fab organization, we are comprised of many chapters with a weaker central organization. This isn't necessarily good. Here I've got some differences between the e-NABLE network and the Fab network, which I admire greatly. We are a movement rather than an organization. That means we have minimal budget, limited reach, and limited power to change policy. On the other hand, because we are a non-organization, we've been able to escape many of the institutional boundaries that the incumbents put together. We have been able to produce medical devices without going through the medical approval process. We've been able to reach people who don't have insurance. We've been able to reach and help people who don't have access to prosthetists because we are amateurs. And amateurs who are not selling products are, in many parts of the world, an unregulated population. And if many parts of the world and the regulations and the organizations are going in the wrong direction, it may be that being somewhat disorganized and as a non-organization is a way to do things that conventional organizations are failing to do. Also, e-NABLE has a much narrower scope. Upper limb prosthetics is a niche problem. And by the way, we're well aware that even though we have delivered tens of thousands of devices to people who wouldn't otherwise get them, it's still a fraction of a percent of all the people who would reach them, who would get them. On the other hand, we have reached those people, and as time goes on, we reach more and more. And these are people who are still not on the radar of conventional organizations because it's a niche problem, because they don't have money, they don't have access to prosthetists or medical care, and yet we do get to them. So that's actually a strength of what we do, and our ability to escape regulation and to just try to address the problem is part of our secret. And like the network of Fab Labs, we do struggle to make caring trump technophilia, which is to say, I think it's fair to say that many of the people involved in Fab networks and many of the people involved in e-NABLE are in love with digital fabrication technologies. But e-NABLE is necessarily embarrassed if we find ourselves developing yet another motorized bionic arm that is too complicated for volunteers to be able to assemble and deliver. The fact that there are people in need who we are organized to serve at least tells us that we need to struggle to resist the urge to develop really cool technology if the coolness does not actually contribute to greater reach. And so while we do keep an eye on higher tech, we are always looking for simple and robust solutions. And we do have a global network of designers making and delivering solutions. So let's see, at this point, I'm going to just try to summarize this part of the e-NABLE story and speak up if you have questions or if this video never resolves. Okay, non-governmental organizations, governments and businesses, conventional organizations are great, but there are always gaps, and that's where you find the disabled and the underserved, and they fall through the cracks, and it is not a pretty picture. My claim is that e-NABLE, by developing a crowdsourced, caring-based, non-commercial solution for this population, is piloting a larger paradigm, which involves not only a safety net, but a pathway to productivity and independence for the underserved, which can both fill gaps and help make them leaders and change makers in a world that needs new leaders, new change makers with new perspectives. This concludes my short summary of the e-NABLE history and what might be its the lessons it has as we try to deal with the global crises, which frankly, at this point, it's clear need to get more and more of our attention. Let me just pause and see if there are questions or comments. All right, I'm going to continue. I was at a conference on cooperative movements in London a few years ago, and they had a really powerful catchphrase. They said, "We want to put people and the planet ahead of profit." Well, I think that's exactly right. I think e-NABLE has told us that the obvious thing, for example, creating a nonprofit organization because you want to do good but not make money, is not necessarily the right thing. Furthermore, the incumbents, the powers that be, are hard at work right now trying to influence what is obvious, and that becomes an attraction to geeks who work hard to solve geeky problems. We need to work hard to solve the right geeky problems. And as I've begun looking into the climate crisis, I've begun to suspect that the right geeky problem is under-recognized. Now, I'm sure that there are many people in the fab and make communities who will recognize this. But it's not widely understood. And if you already know this, I want to urge you to spread the word. Because while carbon emissions are the obvious problem, and this is the famous heating curve, which shows that carbon emissions have spiked in recent history. Reversing carbon emissions and drawing down carbon, while being an obvious solution, just won't work fast enough. There's an order of magnitude more carbon now in the oceans than there is in the atmosphere, and it's going to take centuries, even if we stop emitting carbon instantly, which we are not doing, for carbon levels to come back down. So carbon is the obvious problem, but it's not necessarily the one we need to focus on. If you zoom in on the Keating curve, you see actually that it's a sawtooth. Yes, carbon levels are rising and rising faster and faster and faster, but every year they go up and they go down. I have good news in this depressing presentation, which is that someone has already invented self-replicating carbon drawdown machines. And they produce a substantial amount of drawdown every year. I'm talking about plants, right? Green biomass sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, which is a great long-term solution to the long-term problem of carbon emissions, as is stopping the carbon emissions. And if you look at this curve, you can see that every summer, plants draw down a huge amount, in fact, much more than the creeping incrementalism of our carbon emissions. A 4% increase in the Earth's biomass would actually match our excess emissions right now. 4% is not much when you consider that 40% of the planet is now degraded land. Humans have taken out 40% of the biosphere, 40% of the biomass, and the parts that we do have in agriculture and so on are not being conducted in such a way as to address this problem either. That is, industrial agriculture, which is an increasingly high-tech, geeky form of industry, is actually further depleting soil and reducing the ability of biomass to sequester carbon. And this is actually a big discovery for me, change the weather. Okay, so plants, it's a miracle. Animals, it's a miracle. They sequester carbon and they store water in the earth, and whereas drawdown will take centuries to reverse the carbon emission situation, plants and restored landscapes cool the environment, they cool themselves, and they cool the planet, and they can do their work not in centuries, but in years. I highly recommend that you watch 1 or 10 Johnny. And I see my internet connection is unstable, and I'm just going to hope that you're still with me.
Yep, you cut out for a minute there.
Okay. So now I have to go back to my presentation. Hello, I've lost my page. Sorry. Which one of these is me? Sorry. I know it's in here. Internet. Just gonna close Windows until I find the right one. Hopefully, if I go to Zoom, will that show me? No. Okay, bear with me. All my homework. All my homework. Getting close. You're still seeing, well, you're seeing my screen now.
Yep.
I think you do this. Okay. Somewhere. There it is. Okay. I'm not even going to attempt to tell this story in detail, but I will point out that we're currently, the planet is locked in a battle between two cycles. For human history, the one on the left has been winning. That's the one in which overgrazing and extractive agriculture destroys soil, destroys savannas, brings down forests. The bare soil then can't support plants. The lack of plants means that the rain washes away the good soil, which means even fewer plants. The soil becomes compact, non-absorbent, and all of the carbon and all of the moisture that was in the soil, not to mention all of the life that was sucking down carbon, is moved ultimately up into the atmosphere, where it forms a moist, dirty, heat-absorbent haze, which is 25 times the greenhouse problem of carbon. Let me just point this out. Airborne carbon CO2, the emissions that we're all appropriately concerned about, represent only 4% of the planet's heat budget. The other 96%, and the 96% that we can have some leverage over, is airborne water. Now, the problem is the hot, moist, dirty, absorbent haze is a very potent and very plentiful greenhouse gas. In contrast, cool, moist, shading, heat-reflecting clouds bounce sunlight back into space. They create shade, and of course, it supports plants, which do all the good things we were talking about. Plants actively cool the landscape through transpiration, not to mention shade. They actively cultivate the soil, which sequesters carbon and feeds the plants. And that whole happy cycle produces local changes in weather and global changes in climate. And by the way, it turns out the plants know what they're doing. Not only do they sequester carbon, but they release bacteria, aerobacteria, into the atmosphere, which convert hot, moist, dirty, heat-absorbent haze into cool, moist, shading, heat-reflecting, rain-generating clouds. Are you with me? Full screen, and let's continue. Hello. Was not the right, that was the right slide, but it's actually not my presentation. Where is my presentation? Sorry. Hello, there it is, okay. All right, now this story is one that you're going to be hearing increasingly, because big business, as ever, is doing what it can to figure out how to make money from this fact. And so we're all hearing a lot about regenerative agriculture these days, which does indeed shift the paradigm somehow and to some extent. And by not destroying the soil, by not chopping up plant roots, by not exposing the surface so that everything evaporates, regenerative agriculture brings carbon and water back into the soil. That's great. And there are a lot of farmers, and they can be paid to sequester carbon and to be less destructive. But it's not just carbon, it's not just farmland, and it can't only be agribusiness, and it can't only be digital. This is a huge opportunity for all of the clever inventors and problem solvers in the Fab Lab network to save the planet. So, by the way, just a few more pictures. The picture on the right shows the difference between the natural state of affairs and modern agriculture. This is clay. This is biomass. All right, it turns out, and I suggest that you look for videos by John D. Liu. Individuals and groups all over the world have found that within one generation, they can regenerate degraded landscapes. And they have discovered that within years, the climate in those landscapes changes. It turns out all of that haze and all of that fog is available even in arid desert landscapes. It's the landscapes that cause the drought. It's not the drought that causes the arid landscapes. When plants or other things can absorb water and grow plants, they create the climate which regenerates the soil. Now, it turns out one of the ways of doing that, greatly enhancing, for example, the soil of the rainforest, which is also, by the way, a thin layer of green on top of relatively unfertile soil, was discovered 1,000 years ago by Indians in the Amazon. They mixed soil and poop and pee and pottery, and they mixed it in with the soil, and it created this incredibly rich soil known as terra preta, which has many times the fertility and the growing power of natural dirt. It turns out that, I left out an important part of what they put in, the critical part. Included in that soil was biochar. They were burning biomass in low oxygen conditions. That's called pyrolysis. It's not really burning. It's no smoke, it's low oxygen, and it results in charcoal. It turns out that for every percentage increase in the charcoal, in the carbon content of soil, an acre can hold 20,000 more gallons of water. Charcoal is mostly little pockets of air. So listen, we've got more. Not only do the plants draw down, but if we convert that biomass into charcoal, the charcoal does not go back into the atmosphere. Dead plants go back into the atmosphere. Charcoal stays in the ground for 1,000 years, and it absorbs, nourishes microorganisms, and enriches soil. So, by the way, as long as we're now pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, let's remember the point of the carbon is to make healthy soil. There are other good things you can do with carbon, but that is the big one. And there's half a planet worth of land that wants to be enriched this way. Now, there's plenty of opportunity for makers to do cool things. This is a fog harp. Remember all of that hot, moist haze I was talking about? Many of the world's deserts have got plenty of moisture passing over them. And here's a group that has developed a fog harp. It's basically a screen mesh which collects fog, condenses it into water, and that can go right into the ground. That can produce liters and liters per day. It's really simple. Traditional fog harps, they've been around for 10 or 20 years, are wire mesh. These clever people realized that the wire mesh, the horizontal bands, cause the droplets to stick. And so vertical bands triple the effectiveness of these fog harps. This is not rocket science. I've started to experiment with 3D printing of fog harps. Maybe that's the right solution, maybe it isn't. But the point is, this is really cool technology. It can make a really big difference. Aquaponics, hydroponics are great, but again, we're looking for solutions that can cover degraded land, of which there is an abundance. This slide here describes what Walter Jani, the scientist I mentioned before, calls a wicking bath. It turns out in the ground or on top of the ground, if your soil is poisonous, or if you're trying to turn a parking lot into a green environment, which you should do, you basically take a bucket and you put a water reservoir under the bucket, and you put a plastic or other water impermeable surface on top here. And now none of the water evaporates, and all of the soil gets to be committed to whatever you have planted in this bucket. It is 10 times more effective than conventional agriculture, in which 98% of the water goes back up into the air. So I've mentioned 3 technologies that have caught my eye. Oh, there's one more that I want to mention. In this restoring landscape story, this isn't necessarily a large-scale project. There is one woman in Mexico whose picture and name I have misplaced. But she bought some barren but beautiful land just south of the US-Mexico border. And she realized that there's rain and there's floods, and that's responsible for those dramatic arroyos, which wash all the soil away and just produce these canyons. She said, I wonder what would happen if I put rocks in the creek beds. Well, she discovered, as Mexicans have known for thousands of years, that if you put rocks in the creek beds, it slows down the water. That means more of the water soaks into the ground. It means more of the dirt, which would be washed away, gets caught behind the rocks. Within 30 years, she had this kind of an impact. One woman and her partners had this kind of an impact on a landscape not smaller than this one. Putting rocks in creeks is not rocket science. By the way, who says it has to be rocks? How about plastic bottles filled with dirt? How about any number of interesting things that we can think of doing? Okay, so these are some interesting, tinker-friendly, planet-saving examples of what can happen if you get your eye on the ball and you realize that there is a huge opportunity to solve the planetary crisis, not in centuries, in restoring climate in the short term, by restoring biomass in the short term. And that will also, by the way, take care of the carbon problem in the long term, as long as we bring down emissions and use these self-replicating drawdown machines to turn atmospheric carbon into a soil-based climate solution. Now, by the way, all of these come together in an interesting way if you consider this scene in the bottom right here. Degraded landscapes is where they put refugee camps, typically, because it's worthless land, and that's where you put people that you don't know what to do with. Now, by the way, there are increasing numbers of climate refugees, people whose land has been dried up or whose nations are at war because they're fighting over water and limited natural resources because we are destroying the natural resources. and we stockpile them in these humongous barren environments. And then, because we're not all completely heartless, although we are fairly misguided, we bring them water and we bring them food, and we hope that they will be patient until we come up with a longer-term solution. Water, food, that becomes carbon-rich human waste. Here are all of these people living in a landscape that used to support trees, who could be given the resources with their ample time to begin building soil by growing plants, even in an environment like this. Soil is the most valuable thing on the planet right now. Let them create it, let them own it. Let them potentially feed themselves with it, and let them, by the way, ultimately own some of this worthless land that we've planted them in. And as they do, we move the borders of the refugee camp so that we can systematically begin to reclaim more of those landscapes. My point is, and it's just an example, happens to be my favorite example, that climate refugees, like amputees, have got a great deal to offer the world if we empower them to be part of the solution. We now have amputees who are some of our most productive designers of 3D printed prosthetics in e-NABLE. We can have people who are living in degraded landscapes, repairing those landscapes, improving their own quality of life, and also fixing the planet. There are all sorts of interesting opportunities for Fab type people to facilitate this process. Waste removal, composting toilets, biochar, wicking baskets, drones that can spot particular parts of the landscape that need more water, or can alert people that there's an opportunity for remediation here. Internet coverage to make us able to do it more intelligently. There are lots of things we can do. My point is, if we don't restore the biosphere, all of our good work, everything we spend most of our time talking about, working about, being proud that we invented, will be for naught. And as we've seen in the last year or two, this is not a hypothetical anymore. It's going up in flames today. If we do work on restoring the biosphere, we have an amazing arena for digital and non-digital collaborative invention using distributed parallel models of the sort that the Fab network, and in its humble way, the e-NABLE network, has done. A global network of volunteers caring, not necessarily trying to make money, but caring for underserved populations and ecosystems can, especially if it avoids the traps of the call for profit, the call for industrialization, the call for cool high tech that actually doesn't address the problem. A global network of volunteers caring for underserved populations and ecosystems can and must go where traditional businesses, governments, and even NGOs don't or won't or can't go. Human evolution in modern history is increasingly a move towards centralized, industrialized, monetized systems enforced by centralized governments that use force to compel their citizens to meet the needs of big business. They don't just use force. The digital evolution is also taking us in ways that cause us to be fixated on digital technologies. And frankly, that is not our most attractive pose. There are things we can do to try to get away from the economic traps that draw us down a path that's just destroying the planet, and the psycho-technical traps that distract us with cool media and cool technology that force us to take our eye off of the ball. The ball, I would claim, hello, is that we need fab landscapes, not just fab cities, and not just fab labs. And that if we do this in the right way, and we scale up so that all of our inventors and all of the people our inventors talk to and all of the people who need help can be a part of taking vast amounts of underused real estate and turning it into a new Eden, we can have the time of our lives and ensure that our grandchildren have lives as well. But we're not going to do it by sticking with business as usual. And I suspect that we're not going to do it by simply trying to form more and more powerful organizations and businesses. We're going to do it by saying that this is an opportunity for collaboration, invention, and caring. That there are prototypes. I claim e-NABLE is a kind of prototype. I think the Fab Lab network is increasingly, it's come a long way since the last Fab conference I was at, where frankly, it was still a geek fest. Now I see a lot of groups talking about geekery for goodery. And I think we should get on with it. That's my story. And I would welcome discussion. And I'm going to wait for questions or comments.
Hello.
Hello.
May I? Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing. And yeah, I understand that e-NABLE did have a very good model when we can spread out very large like that. But the one thing that I'm a little bit concerned for myself, because when I do the hand e-NABLE hand project at Fab Lab Hanoi, we did have some issue with the issue from ourselves. Maybe because when we implement following the direction from the e-NABLE and then we deliver it to our potential, maybe we can call a client or we can call amputees.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. And then we did receive some not good feedback because of they are not really satisfied with the printed device. So I just have one question: is that how about we control about the quality of the I can say product or something? Yeah, I mean the thing that we would like to deliver to our
Right.
amputee. Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
Because somehow
one of the things that I agree. One of the things that a global distributed network of volunteers is not good at is quality control. For that matter, it's crowd control. What devices have you delivered? What kinds of devices?
Okay.
Can you? Yeah, it might be an unlimited arm. It might be a Phoenix hand.
It's the simple one, as I remember, because it's long time ago. But yeah, okay. Juan, can you share more with him? Because I have another team members here. I
Sure.
just cook. You mean?
Well, you're finding that I will address the general issue, but then I'm interested. So
yeah.
So this is a real problem with an e-NABLE, and I don't want to pretend that we've solved all of the problems. I usually argue that we need to put out devices which are substantially better than nothing if what people have is nothing. But, and by the way, the psychological and emotional contribution of getting a device from a community of volunteers who are trying to help is a significant contribution, even if the device itself is not as good as we would like it to be. And the devices are not as good as we would like them to be. In fact, we have developed more robust and simpler devices over the years. And one of the problems with the distributed network is that it's hard to get the word out. I would suggest, Fong, that you take a look, for example, at the gripper hand. It has one moving part. It's a spring-loaded thumb, which, however, gives the appearance of a regular hand and allows people to hold on to things. It's, I think, more useful and more robust than the fancy e-NABLE hands that we're famous for. But listen, this is an e-NABLE specific problem. You can write to me and I'll be quite happy to see what I can do to help. And you should join the e-NABLE Hub and complain that your devices are not satisfying your people. Because we too tend to be distracted by trying to build the best, coolest thing rather than the most useful, robust thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my point here is when we apply this model to other, so to other problems that we would like to solve with the e-NABLE model. So I think we have the same issue with the quality control. That is the main point that I would like to ask. I mean, who will monitor for the quality control if we?
You know, I don't have a. It's a good question. In the particular domain that I'm talking about, an aerial photograph makes it very clear whether the ground is brown or green. It's actually very hard to get feedback from maker volunteers and from the recipients. And the feedback that we do get is spotty. But monitoring landscapes is actually something that we can do pretty effectively, I think, with satellites and drones. And frankly, the greenness of the earth and the temperature on the ground are two quite good ways of assessing what's working and what isn't. Okay,
I got what you mean. You mean that you would like you would use some kind of digital system, something like that, and then make it to monitor and collect data for you, and then you will have someone to how can I say, analyze those received data, and then you can conclude that this will be qualified or not, right?
Well, that's right. And I'll point out that you know, it's one of the miracles, but these days those digital systems mounted on satellites and visible through the internet are already available. So the metrics are actually available. It's the activities that we need to get going.
Okay.
And, you know, unlike e-NABLE, I don't even have a clear, simple recipe or proof to say, here's what you need to do. But there are people who do have clear, simple recipes, and they are doing it.
Yeah.
I'm not a gardener. I'm actually not much of a gardener. I garden virtual communities, but there are people who know how to do it. And I think that if many, many people try, it will eventually become clearer what solutions are right for what ecosystems and what cultures.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Fong.
Thank you.
And please stay in touch.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments as our hour comes to a close?
I want to say thanks. Really inspiring. Yeah,
well,
let's go plant.
Okay. Leo, send me an email.
Okay.
And we'll try to get something going.
Okay, thanks everyone here.
It is 12:30. Ariana, I believe we have filled our hour.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.